and we're going to mainly cover the female reproduction because this is quite a heavy exercise. So to begin with, I am going to start with the uterine cycle, which I briefly did an overview of at the end of exercise 42. So the uterine cycle is going to be a three-step process, or a three-phase process, that is going to cycle through the stratum basalis and the stratum functionalis. So the first phase of the uterine cycle is going to be the menstrual phase. The menstrual phase. This will be the phase where you will shed the endometrium, or the endometrium will be shed. So menstrual phase is the shedding of the endometrium. This will typically occur around day 1 to 5 of the uterine cycle. The next phase of the uterine cycle is going to be the proliferation phase. The proliferation phase is where you will rebuild that functional layer that was shed. So you will be rebuilding the functionalis layer. It was just shed in menstrual phase, and now we're going to rebuild it. This is going to be days 6 to 14. And the end of this, it will end with the process of ovulation, which is the release of the egg from the ovary. So we have the menstrual phase, we have the proliferation phase, and then there will be the third phase, which is the secretory phase. The secretory phase is where it will begin after ovulation, and it is going to be under the influence of progesterone. So essentially, secretory phase is the secretion of a hormone. So that's where the name comes from. The primary hormone that's going to be secreted is going to be the progesterone. And what's happening with the secretory phase is you will have an enriched blood supply that will occur. So not only have we now grown or developed that functionalis layer back, but there will be a heavy, heavy blood supply that will be produced. There will also be an increase in gland secretion and hormones. Things will be secreted, i.e. in the secretory phase. So the menstrual phase is day 1 through 5. The proliferation days is day 6 through 14, and then ends with ovulation. And the secretory phase will be the rest of the uterine cycle. So that will be days 15 to 28. So this is going to be what we usually refer to in modern day nomenclature as the menstrual cycle, is really what this is referring to. So we're going to do time on the x-axis. We're going to start with day 1 and go to day 28. So instead of a 30-day, thinking about a month, it is technically on a 28-day cycle. If we split that in the middle, we get 14. At day 14, right in the middle of this uterine cycle, at day 14, this will be ovulation. So that means this is when the egg will be released from the ovary. That is the next process that we're going to talk about, but that will occur at day 14. So day 1, day 14, and day 28. So if we were to look at these uterine cycles, we said that day 1 to day 5, this was going to be the phase of the menstrual phase. Day 1 through 5 was the menstrual phase. And then we said day 5 through 14 was the proliferation phase. And then we said 14 to 28 was going to be the secretory phase. So this is how we're going to graph these. What we are talking about when we are graphing the menstrual, the proliferation, and the secretory phase, what we are actually looking at and talking about is going to be the thickness of the endometrium. So that is going to be the y-axis. The thickness of the endometrium. So now, if we look at this, the menstrual phase, day 1, way up here, we said that the menstrual phase was shedding the endometrium. That means at day 1, the endometrium had a thick layer, and then at day 4, we are day 5, we are decreasing that endometrium layer. So day 1 to 5, the graph will start high and then low. We will have a thick endometrium and then it will get thinner. Once you get to day 5, we're going to start the next phase, which is our proliferation phase, and we said that the proliferation phase was rebuilding that layer from 6 to 14. So then we're going to go back and start slowly rebuilding that layer. So that's what's happening in the proliferation phase. And then we said in the secretory phase that it was going to be mainly blood supplies, secretions, and that was going to be day 15 to 18. So this just kind of tapers and stays up here. Now remember, this is a cycle. So at day 14, it'll start day 1, and the cycle will repeat. So we'll go up here, and then it will go down to day 5, and then it will increase up to day 14. And we are essentially cycling. So this is the thickness of the endometrium. This is your uterine cycle. So that's what's happening in that process. The next thing we're going to talk about is how this relates to the ovarian cycle. So this was the uterus, and now we're going to talk about another organ that has its own cycle, and then we're going to graph these two together. So the ovarian cycle. So we just did the uterine, so put that to the side. Now we're going to do the ovarian, and then we're going to graph the two together. So the ovarian cycle, we're tracking two things. We are tracking both the egg and the follicle. So the egg is actually going to be the gamete, or the sex cell, and the follicle will produce the gamete. So these are both found in the ovary. So we're looking at the egg production and then the follicle production. A couple terms real quick when it comes to the egg. The term ovum means egg. It's Latin for egg. However, the term oocyte is immature egg. So ovum will mean egg. Oocyte is going to be a term for essentially an immature egg. So as we go, we're looking at the follicle and at the egg. So the way I like to do this is we're going to do one side that's the egg and one side that is the follicle. Because remember, when we looked at exercise 42, if this is going to be my ovary, inside my ovary was my follicle, and inside my follicle was my egg. So those are the two structures we're looking at right now. So your follicle will go from a structure that is called the primordial follicle. The primordial follicle is the first type. This will be present at birth. The primordial follicle will be present at birth, which means every time a female is born, she is born with all of the immature houses or the immature primordial follicles that will eventually house an egg. So the primordial follicle will be present at birth. Then we'll go through life, and then once you hit the state of puberty, as a female, these primordial follicles will start changing. It will become the primary follicle. So the primordial will become the primary follicle. And this will happen around the age of whenever puberty starts. That primary follicle will eventually change into the secondary follicle. And that secondary follicle will be a similar structure to the primary follicle, but it will be slightly different. So this secondary follicle will start enlarging. So we're talking about the house or the little round structure that is holding the egg inside the ovary. So our primary or primordial follicle is going to have a primary oocyte inside. Our primary follicle, which has now developed from our primordial follicle, so we've morphed into this guy, he is still going to be housing a primary oocyte. Our egg is still a immature egg cell. Once you get to the secondary follicle and this house starts going from a small structure to a larger structure, essentially, as it enlarges, that primary follicle is going to be, that primary oocyte will become a secondary oocyte. So in our secondary follicle, we will have a secondary oocyte. Once you start hitting the part of puberty where there is a menstrual cycle every month, this secondary follicle will develop and grow and kind of change its structure. And it will become and turn into what is called a vesicular follicle. A vesicular follicle is going to be the mature follicle. And inside the vesicular follicle, you will have the mature egg. So at this point, it will be considered an secondary oocyte that will become the egg. So we are right before we have produced an egg. Inside our vesicular follicle, we're going to have a mature secondary oocyte. And when the vesicular follicle ruptures, which will happen for a female at day 14 of her uterine cycle, when that vesicular follicle ruptures, an egg is released. So if we have our small primary follicle with our oocyte inside, we get a secondary follicle with our secondary oocyte inside. Your vesicular follicle, didn't finish that, will look a little bit different. So your vesicular follicle will be a much larger structure. Your egg will be on the inside, or your secondary oocyte will be on the inside, and it will be a much larger structure. And there will be essentially a little crown all the way around it. This little crown is going to be the corona radiata, not to be confused with anything that is a topic of discussion around corona currently. But corona means crown. So there's a corona radiata that is around that oocyte. And then when the vesicular follicle will mature and it erupts, essentially it will release out of the system that egg with that coronary or corona radiata all the way around it, and this will go down your fallopian tubes. So at this point we have our vesicular follicle. It has ruptured and it is an egg that has been released from the system. So your egg stays an egg. So on this pathway right here, we go from primary oocyte to secondary oocyte to mature egg. But our follicle will go from a primordial follicle to a primary follicle to a secondary follicle, which will become a vesicular follicle. That vesicular follicle is the mature form, and that will rupture every month. One of them will rupture every month at day 14 of the uterine or the female cycle, and that egg will be released. But that structure that was the vesicular follicle will still be there inside the ovary. So he will actually continue. So your vesicular follicle will become your corpus luteum. Misspelled that. Your corpus luteum. Which will look kind of like that structure. That corpus luteum will start to decay over time and will eventually produce the corpus albicans. The corpus albicans is what a female will have remaining in her ovaries for every egg that has been released or every vesicular follicle that has ruptured. So the corpus albicans essentially is a small shrunken little structure because the corpus luteum will start to decay, but it never decays completely. So this is happening inside the ovaries. What happens if we put the uterine cycle, which is a 28-day 3 sequence phases, and we put the ovarian cycle, which is looking at the egg and the follicle? What happens if we put them on the same graph? Because the female cycle is a 28-day cycle. So we're going to do that real quick. We have day 1, day 14, and day 28. When we're looking at day 1, we're going to look at both the uterine and the ovarian cycle. So we're going to start with the uterine. Remember, at day 1 and day 5, that's really important for the uterine cycle. We're looking at the thickness of the endometrium. It goes from high to low to back up to pretty stable. Remember, day 14. So the uterine cycle is going to be this from day 1 to 5, day 5 to 14, and day 6 to 14, and day 15 to 28. But now, if we were to graph on this same plane, the next cycle, which was our ovarian cycle, it follows the same 1, 14, 28-day cycle. So the beginning, we are going to have at day 1, you are going to have your vesicular follicle. So right here, it will be your vesicular follicle. That vesicular follicle will then become, at day 14, when ovulation occurs, it will then become the corpus luteum. Between middle of that to day 28, that will become the corpus albicans. So now remember, the primordial follicle, the primary follicle, and the secondary follicle are all what are occurring from birth to puberty. But once we get to that vesicular follicle or that dominant follicle stage, that will occur and stay at that phase. And then when we get to day 14, or the process of ovulation, when that egg is released from that vesicular follicle, he'll become the corpus luteum, and then he'll become the corpus albicans. So remember, right here, we're at ovulation. Okay, so those are the 2 cycles. We have our ovarian cycle and we have our uterine cycle. But we have also talked a lot about what happens with our hormones. So if we take these 2 cycles and our uterine cycle and then our ovarian cycle, and we were to also put together 2 sets of hormones. So I'm going to try and make this work. So we have ovulation occurring at day 14. So we are going to look at 2 sets of hormones. First hormone we're going to look at is going to be estrogen plus progesterone. And then the next group of hormones we're going to look at are going to be luteinizing hormone and follicle stimulating hormone, or FSH. So this is LH and FSH, which we talked about when we talked about the anterior pituitary and the posterior pituitary. So if we look at these same things with estrogen and progesterone and luteinizing hormone and follicle stimulating hormone, we've already talked about a couple reasons. So real quick, estrogen will trigger ovulation. Not just estrogen, increased estrogen will trigger ovulation. So if we look at our estrogen, and we're going to title that red, our estrogen will jump up and increase right before ovulation. And then it will come back down. It will go through a slight buffer on the other side. So estrogen, an increased level of estrogen, happens before day 14, and that triggers ovulation. So there's a spike of estrogen right before day 14. So that's what's happening in that world. Also remember that there was an increase in progesterone when there was the corpus luteum. So when we reviewed the corpus luteum, we said that it was responsible for producing progesterone. So the corpus luteum is right here. So it is occurring after day 14. So if we take our corpus luteum, we're going to have low levels of progesterone, low levels of progesterone. Oh, look, we now have our corpus luteum, so we're going to increase those levels of progesterone, and then these will come back down. So our progesterone will be the yellow. So essentially what we're doing here is we're looking at the levels of estrogen and progesterone related to the uterine and the ovarian cycle. So related to the uterine cycle, ovulation occurs at day 14. An increase in estrogen right before that will trigger ovulation. So around day 12, 13, somewhere in there, there's a spike of estrogen, which triggers ovulation at day 14. So that's why the estrogen graph looks like that. Progesterone is going to be produced by the corpus luteum in the ovary. So when progesterone increases, it's because there is the corpus luteum. So after day 14, after ovulation, that vesicular follicle becomes the corpus luteum. And when it becomes the corpus luteum, it will increase and produce more progesterone in the later half of the cycle. So that's what's going on in those two, which is very cool to be able to associate and see how those work together. But we have two other hormones. We have a luteinizing hormone and we have follicle stimulating hormone. And what's happening with those two hormones is also related to our estrogen and our progesterone. So let's talk about that real quick. An increase in estrogen will trigger the release of LH. So an increase in estrogen triggers the release of luteinizing hormone. So if we're going to make our luteinizing hormone green, we have an increase in estrogen, remember, right here before ovulation. So if we have an increase in estrogen there, we are going to have an increase in luteinizing hormone right after it. So an increase in that estrogen, which is right here, will trigger an increase in luteinizing hormone, which happens right there. Luteinizing hormone is responsible for regulating the cycles of the ovarian cycle and releasing the egg. Follicle stimulating hormone. If we have an increase in luteinizing hormone, you will also have a small increase in follicle stimulating hormone. So an increase in estrogen triggers the release of LH and small amounts of FSH. So that means our follicle stimulating hormone will also get a little bump around the same time. Follicle stimulating hormone, if we look at that name, follicle stimulating hormone. The follicle we are talking about is this guy right here. So when we see a spike right here in follicle stimulating hormone, that is stimulating the follicle to release the egg, which occurs right after it at day 14. So this is how the ovarian cycle, which is looking at the egg and the follicle, relates to the uterine cycle, which is looking at the 3 phases and the thickness of the endometrium, relates to the primary 4 hormones in the female reproductive system, which is estrogen and progesterone, luteinizing hormone, and follicle stimulating hormone. So to briefly run through those hormones, an increase in estrogen will trigger ovulation. So ovulation is at day 14. Ovulation is the release of the egg. There will be an increase in estrogen right before day 14. Once that egg is released, the vesicular follicle now becomes the corpus luteum because it's going to have released that egg. That corpus luteum will actually be produced because of there's an increase in progesterone. So an increase in progesterone occurs because the corpus luteum will produce it. So that is why the graph will then, in the latter half of the uterine cycle, will have an increase in progesterone. But looking at LH and FSH, an increase in estrogen right here, right before day 14, also triggers the release of LH, which is this guy right here. So we will have a bump in our LH numbers slightly after estrogen increases. There's also a small increase of FSH. That FSH is follicle stimulating hormone. So these little increases in these amounts occurs right before ovulation. Follicle stimulating hormone, by definition, is responsible for stimulating the follicle to release the egg. So there is an increase in FSH right before day 14, which is ovulation because it is stimulating the vesicular follicle to release the egg at day 14. So again, these are how the 4 cycles, the 2 cycles and then the 4 hormones all work together for the female reproductive system. Pretty in depth, but we're going to briefly talk about spermatogenesis. So that was the female reproductive system with our production of our egg and the release of the egg and all of the hormones and the uterus responsibility that went along with it. But just briefly talking about spermatogenesis, we're not going to go into this one super in depth either, but this is going to be the production of the gametes in the males. So we are creating sperm. So this is the production of the gamete or the sperm in males. This will occur in the seminiferous tubules in the testes. So this will occur in the testes. So the testes again are producing that sperm. Just like we had the oocyte as the primitive germ cell for females, spermatogomia will be the immature or the primitive stem cell in males. So thinking about oocyte as the immature egg, spermatogomia is the immature cell for sperm. So brief overview, we're not going to go super in depth on this one, but for spermatogenesis, what is occurring here is it is occurring in the testes, and it's going to follow a very similar phrasing of how things work just like the female did. So it's going to start with the spermatogonium. So we're going to start here. These guys will be present in the body. But what happens will then occur at puberty. So just like in the female cycle, the follicle did not change until puberty. Males, the spermatogonium will not change until puberty. But at puberty, FSH, so follicle stimulating hormone, will actually be secreted. And when that FSH is secreted, you will get your spermatogomium that will turn into a primary spermatocyte. It will turn into a primary spermatocyte. That primary spermatocyte will become a secondary spermatocyte. So very similar to the female process. Now, because the germ cell is haploid, your primary spermatocyte will be 2N, and you will have a secondary spermatocyte, which will be N, but then you will also have another one that will be the secondary spermatocyte. Spermato. Okay, I don't know what just happened, but let me get back to that guy for you. So with this spermatogenesis, and we have our spermatogomium becoming our primary spermatocyte, he will then turn into the secondary spermatocyte. But the primary will be 2N, it will be diploid, and then your secondary spermatocyte will be haploid, but there will be a second one. He will split into two. We are only going to focus on the one. So technically the primary spermatocyte, which is a 2N, will split into two secondary spermatocytes, but I really want you to know the fact that primary will become secondary. So that secondary spermatocyte will then turn into the spermatotids. This is a not functional gamete. So this is similar in structure to sperm, but it is not a functional sperm. It's not a functional gamete because this guy is not mobile. So spermatotids do not have the ability to swim. That spermatotids will then go through a process to become sperm. And that process where it goes from spermatotids to sperm will be called spermiogenesis. So this process right here is called spermiogenesis. And then that sperm will be the mature gamete that can allow for reproduction. So spermatogenesis is the production of gametes or the mature sperm cell. It starts with spermatogonium. These are present in the body, and then at puberty will convert into the primary spermatocyte once FSH, so follicle stimulating hormone, is released. The primary spermatocyte will turn into the secondary spermatocyte, which is going to be haploid. That will turn into a spermatotid, which is similar, almost a functional gamete, but it is not because it is not mobile. It will go through a process called spermiogenesis, which will then convert that into sperm. So that is how male sperm will be produced. So again, the focus of this is really going to be on the uterine cycle, the ovarian cycle, the 4 female hormones, but the male hormone for spermatogenesis will be FSH, and you do need to know that one.